Afternoon, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Colin Call. I'm a senior fellow here at FSI, and I'm the social science co-director at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. I also lead up the Stanford Middle East Initiative, which is housed here at FSI. We do a periodic seminar series on all things Middle East, but in particular focused on the changing nature of power, influence, competition, and cooperation in the region. And today we are thrilled to have with us Jana Bowler. Jana is a lecturer in the politics of the Middle East at the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent. Jana's research focuses on counterinsurgency, rebel governance, and regional diplomacy in the Middle East. His book, The Kurdish Liberation Movement in Iraq, was published in 2014, and he is currently working on a number of projects relating to militia recruitment, counterinsurgency, ethnic defection, and the impact of anti-colonial ideas on shaping post-colonial separatist strategies, as well as the role of diaspora communities as a transnational civil society actor. Today, he'll be speaking to us on the socio-political effects and strategies associated with pro-government militias in the Middle East and beyond. Jana, welcome to Stanford. We look forward to your presentation, and Jana will speak for a while, and then we'll open it up for conversation and discussion. So, please.
Thank you so much, Colin. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very grateful to be here. Just to say a few words about why I'm actually here in Stanford. First of all, it's because I wanted to escape the atrocious weather in London, and I thought that could be a really good opportunity. But it's also because I'm also preparing I'm also trying to prepare another research project that I'm interested in, and that is carrying a research on the history of northern Iraq and the question of Ba'athist control over northern Iraq. So, as some of you probably know, the Hoover Institution is home to one, the most important archive on Iraq. A real treasure that really gives us an insight on the operations of a very authoritarian, very secretive regime. So I came here as part of my effort to prepare for this research project, and I used the opportunity also to present my research to you today. In terms of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm actually here to talk about militias in counterinsurgency. Now, to be a bit more precise, I'm actually here to talk about pro-government militias, right? So, which means irregular forces that governments use to fight insurgents at the time of need, right? Now, to be even more precise, to narrow things even further, I'm actually interested in what I define as defector militias, right? So, the term, obviously the term defector militias come from the concept of defection, right? And for those of you who are familiar with the literature on civil wars, there's the concept of ethnic defection, right? So the process in which members of the group that fight against the government actually end up joining the government, fighting against the members of their own group, right? So, so if for example, in the context of Iraq, which I'm going to talk about today, this means Kurds who actually chose to join the Ba'ath government, the forces of Saddam Hussein, to fight against Kurdish nationalists. Or in the case of Sudan, which is another case that I'm going to talk about today, it means members of southern groups, tribes, ethnic groups, joining the government forces from Khartoum to fight against southern separatists. So just before we proceed, I just want to make I want to make it clear that what I'm going to talk about today is an episode in the history of Iraq and Sudan. So, I assume that some of you may be more interested in more contemporary affairs in Iraq and Sudan. So, I don't want to disappoint you too much, but I'm going to focus more on earlier periods in the history of these countries. Although I will try to show I will try to show the relevance of this research topic on more contemporary affairs, especially in Iraq, because I know there's a bit more interest in what is going on in Iraq. Okay, so just to go back to my concept, just to go back to the subject that I focus on, clearly I'm focusing on very particular set of actors in international politics, right? I focus on militias, on pro-government defector militias. However, these particular actors have actually become very significant. Sorry, I just want to make sure that. Oh.
Is it working for you?
Not really. Oh, there you go. Yeah, sorry. I need to get used to that. So I'm talking about very particular actors in international politics. However, these actors have actually become very influential in domestic conflicts, right? They've become a regular feature of civil wars across the globe. It's difficult to quantify. There haven't been really, there haven't been too many studies that quantified the existence of this phenomenon. But one study that actually tried to do it pointed out that between 1992 and 2007, governments in 61 countries ended up using pro-government militias as part of their counterinsurgency operations. Now, if we take into account the fact if we take into account the wars in Syria and Yemen and Libya, we can safely say that the number of these actors has probably increased dramatically. So we are talking about very significant actors in conflict, right? And as I said, I'm focusing on Iraq and Sudan, but these are just two examples. I mean, there are even more notable examples. In Turkey, for instance, the Turkish government has relied extensively on the village guards as part of its war against the PKK, right? So the village guards are Turkish forces that fight along with the Turkish government against Kurdish nationalists. And we are talking about 150,000 such, guards. Another good example, which shows the span of this phenomenon, is the Kadyrovsky in Russia. Right? During the Chechen wars, the Russians relied heavily on Chechen defectors, especially former insurgents, joining Russian forces to fight against the Chechen rebels. So we are talking about a rather significant phenomenon. And the pervasiveness, the existence of such militias in so many different conflicts has actually attracted the growing, it's been the subject of a growing scholarly and policy interest. The problem with this field of study is that, generally speaking, most of the works on militias have tended to focus on their tactical and military uses, right? So there are quite a few works, books, articles, policy papers that try to understand this phenomenon, right? They try to understand why governments give up on their monopoly over violence, why governments actually outsource their control over military violence and give it to non-state actors, right? To these non-state actors that operate especially in the periphery. And most of the explanations concern the tactical military uses, right? So most of the studies point out, for example, that governments rely on militias because they need forces that they could mobilize easily, right? Because they need to cover for manpower shortages, because militias are actually much cheaper to sustain than regular military forces. Or also because these militias, right, these especially defector militias, are much more familiar with the terrain, geography, and the population of the regions that they fight in, right? So Kurdish forces in Kurdistan, for example, if we stick to my case, would probably know the population and the area much better than an Iraqi soldier who came from Basra or Mosul or Baghdad. Now, I don't deny, in my work, I don't deny the relevance of these explanations, right? I mean, yes, definitely governments recruit militias because of these considerations. However, I argue that militias also have other uses for governments, right? And these uses actually exceed their military uses, right? Their battlefield uses. Pro-government defector militias should also be understood as social, as social and political actors whose existence is a socio-political logic, right? And that actually have implications on society and politics more broadly than just their participation in the battlefield. Now, again, for those of you who've worked on, or for those of you who are familiar with the literature on military-society relations, the idea that armed forces have purposes that go beyond just their military, their initial designation as a fighting force, it makes sense, right? Militaries everywhere have been said to function as melting pots, as political actors, as social actors. However, this logic has kind of been ignored by students of militias. And what I try to argue is that militias are also fighting forces, right? Militias are, militias too have social and political functions. Governments that employ militias, and especially defector militias, actually see them, in these terms, right? In many cases, governments have seen these militias as a way to manipulate societies, as a way to divide the rebel constituency, right? To divide the rebel groups, to instigate, to either create or at least deepen cleavages and divides within these societies, but also as a way to strengthen the loyalty of some segments of the rebel constituency, to make some of the members of this community dependent on them. And I would even say, and this is one of the more, I think this is one of the more controversial aspects of my argument, but I would even say that in some cases, these social and political users of militias have become even more important than their military users. And this is because these militias end up serving the authoritarian government's most strategic interest, namely survival. So, obviously, now, excuse me, at the risk of stating the obvious, my argument applies primarily to societies where ethnic or sectarian identities play a significant role in politics, in citizenship, in loyalty. As a matter of fact, in most post-colonial societies, this description applies to most post-colonial societies. So, so it applies to so my argument applies to many different cases. But I found in this aspect, in this part of my research, I focus on Ba'athist Iraq, so Iraq under the Ba'ath regime between 1968 and 2003, and on Sudan during the First Civil War, so in the 1960s and early 1970s, right? And because these cases provide excellent examples to support my argument. So just to say, this is actually part of a much broader research. I'm also carrying out research on other cases and on militias in different parts of the Middle East. But this is the cornerstone of my research, right? This is the part where I actually try to establish my argument about the way governments perceive militias as social and political actors. And these two cases, Ba'athist Iraq and Sudan, provide good examples to support my argument for three reasons. So the first reason is that militias actually played, pro-government, defector militias, played a key role in the counterinsurgency operations or in, of these governments. The second reason is that the use of these militias actually paved, I would say that it created, not necessarily a path dependence, but it created, it entrenched the thinking that the use of the use of militias is central to the security of these countries. So the point is that even nowadays in Iraq and Sudan, the use of militias is still central to counterinsurgency operations. And you can actually make a link between the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and what is going on today. And this is what I'm going to try and do at the end of the presentation. And finally, is that both of these cases actually provide us with unprecedented access to archival documents and to information. So I mentioned the Ba'ath archives here at the Hoover Institution, which again, we are talking about, if I'm not mistaken, about 16 million documents that shed light on every aspect of the Ba'ath regime. In the case of Sudan, or in the case of South Sudan, my research actually relies on the South Sudan National Archives in Juba, in South Sudan. Now, Juba is an interesting city. It's still growing, and it doesn't have paved roads or traffic lights, but they do have an archive. They have a national archive, which is actually it's nothing, you know, it's nothing similar to what we have here at the Hoover Institution, but but maybe for that reason, it's actually much more interesting to work on it because it's so again it provides an insight into the Sudanese government in the 1960s and 70s and how it tried to strengthen its grip on South Sudan. So for these reasons, I've chosen to start my research with these two cases. So just to move to the more interesting bit, let me, oh, sorry, I missed a slide. Let me move to the case studies themselves. So let's start with Iraq. So as some of you may know, between 1961 and 1991, some would say 2003, but that's a whole different question. Between in these decades, governments in Baghdad faced a Kurdish insurgency in the north, and the Kurdish insurgents, the Kurdish nationalists, and their armed forces, the Peshmerga, they actually proved to be a very resilient force, which the Iraqi army and security forces really failed to defeat, right? So all of the Republican governments, starting from the Qasem government in 1961, when the war started, they tried to rely on Kurdish tribes as part of their counterinsurgency efforts, right? So already in 1961, General Abdel Karim Qasem, the Iraq's first Republican leader, armed the tribes that fought against the Barzani tribe, which was the most dominant tribe in the Kurdish nationalist movement. So this idea of using tribes, of trying to kind of divide the Kurdish rebel constituencies didn't start with the Ba'ath regime. However, the Ba'ath took this strategy a step further, right? It didn't just provide these tribes with weapons on an ad hoc basis, right? Saddam Hussein actually formed militias, and he referred to these militias came to be known as the National Defense Battalions or regiments, depends on how you translate it. But in Arabic, it was Afwaj al-Difa al-Watani, or sometimes Jahafel al-Difa al-Watani. And these militias reported not to the army, but actually reported to the Ba'ath Party's Northern Bureau. And the party provided them not just with weapons, right? It also provided them with uniforms, with special identification cards that made sure that were used to separate them from other Kurds. Now, each battalion had its own commander, which was known as Mustashar, or advisor in Arabic. And perhaps the most important thing about these militias is that these battalions actually replaced military service, which meant that instead of being sent to the front, the recruits to these militias ended up serving in their hometowns, right, near their tribes, near their families. And according to some estimations, at their peak, these militias actually counted about 250,000 people, right? Most of these militia recruits were Kurds, but there were also Turkmen, Yazidi, and there was also an effort to have Assyrian battalions. Assyrian, it's a Christian community based primarily in northern Iraq, but it didn't work very well with the Assyrians. Okay, now the battalions did have now the battalions did have military functions, right? They did, for example, join the Iraqi army in raids on villages that were suspected of sheltering Peshmerga forces. However, and this is something that you can see very clearly in the archives, the commanders, right, the Iraqi officers in the field were mostly displeased with the performance of these militias, right? And they constantly dispatched to Baghdad complaints about the militias' incompetence, their corruption, and their disloyalty. Recruits and mustashars often switched sides with the government given weapons, right? And if they didn't flip, if they didn't join the rebels, they actually sold them their weapons, they sold them information, they sold them intelligence. In other cases, in many other cases, they actually used their weapons they became predators, right? So they actually ended up attacking the Kurdish population and used the weapons to extort the Kurds, which was not what the government wanted them to do, right? The government wanted the Kurds to support, the government wanted the Kurds to support them and object to the Peshmerga. So extorting them and using violence toward them didn't really help that. Now, and probably the worst thing was the fact that these militias were militarily incompetent. In many cases, they simply, when they encountered the Peshmerga, when these battalions, the Kurds, by the way, refer to these battalions as Josh, which means little donkeys in Kurdish. So when these Josh encountered the Peshmerga, they usually fled. They fled the battlefield. So we are talking about a very incompetent, violent force. They didn't really deliver on what the government expected, and yet the regime insisted on maintaining the system, right? And again, we're talking about a very large force. Even at the time when Iraq was fighting Iran, right, in the 1980s, one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century, they were still willing to give up on tens, if not hundreds of thousands of fighters and keep them in their territory rather than using them and sending them to the front. And the reason, and this is where my argument comes into the picture, right? And the thing is that these battalions became very useful for the regime in dividing northern society, and especially Kurdish societies, right? So just to give you, the militias themselves were based almost entirely on tribal and ethno-religious affiliations, right? Documents about the recruitment of these battalions state they have to come from the same tribe, right? The commanders have to, the mustashal, the commanders have to come from the tribe. They have to come, and they have to have a senior position within the tribe so that the recruits would follow them. Again, Turkmens and Yazidis actually had their own special units or battalions. And when it comes to the Yazidis, this point is actually very important because the Yazidis are a Kurdish-speaking religious group, right? They have their own monotheistic religion, and historically they've lived on the margins of the majority Sunni Kurdish society, and they've actually had a very complex relations with the Sunni majority, right? Now, Kurdish nationalists have actually invested a lot of effort in including the Yazidis within the Kurdish nationalist movement. But for the Iraqi government, it was, so the Iraqi government actually wanted to break this connection between the two groups. Yeah, going back to the Yazidis, for the Iraqi government, it was actually politically important to try and separate the Yazidis from the Kurds. So initially, the government tried to enlist the Yazidis into the regular army, but the Yazidis didn't really like the idea, and they rebelled against this decision. So the government accepted that maybe it's better to recruit Yazidis into their own special units, but they made sure that Yazidis won't serve with Sunni Kurds, right? Each tribe, each group had their own units, and even in the discussion about the recruitment of Yazidis and the creation of what the Saraya Yazidiyya, the Yazidi companies, you actually had one officer saying, right, forming the Yazidi battalions will affect their feelings of belonging to the Arab community, Ummah, and abolish sectarian and racist sentiments among their ranks, right? So they actually saw the militias as a way to Arabize the Yazidis in a way. But again, it wasn't just the makeup of these battalions that indicates the Ba'athist use of militias, right? Now, we have to remember, those of you who are familiar a bit with the Ba'ath party, at least in theory, the party objected to any mentioning of a person's religious or tribal affiliation. In Iraq, there were no Arabs, there were Arabs, but there were no Sunnis, there were no Shia, there were no Yazidis. There were Iraqis, either Iraqi Arabs or Iraqi Kurds. But when it came to the north, and especially when it came to documents relating to collaborators, right? So to these militias or to the, but also to other collaborators, the documents clearly stated tribal and sectarian affiliation. And what I try to show, what I argue is that this is because stating these affiliations helped to achieve these divisions in the Kurdish society that the Ba'ath government tried to achieve. Now, okay, so this is just a very short video of Saddam Hussein greeting some of these militia leaders. Okay, this video it did work when I prepared the presentation, but it's a very short video. Again, the point is that the strategy actually worked for some time, because it's not only that the Kurdish insurgents had to direct their resources to fight against other Kurds, right? Which was quite important. But those other Kurds, right? Those Kurds who collaborated with Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath regime actually ended up becoming completely dependent on the government. So whenever there was a sign that the regime was to reconcile with the Kurdish nationalists or to make some concessions toward them, the leaders of the defecting tribes and the mustashas were probably some of the first to protest against it, right? So just to put it shortly, the militias became a strategic tool in the hands of the Iraqi government in breaking and dividing Kurdish society. And when the Kurds gained their autonomy in 1991, one of the first things that they did is to settle accounts with some of the mustashas. Not all of them, again, because some of the mustashas actually switched again to the side of the rebels before the Kurds gained their autonomy. But those who didn't, they paid a heavy price for that. They kill them or punish them or yeah, I mean, some of them were executed. No, there are no clear statistics on that. There are no numbers, but it's known that some of these mustashas were actually executed by the Kurdish authorities. Now, the story, I'll move to Sudan very briefly, because the story in Sudan is rather similar. As part of the war between the predominantly Muslim Arab governments in Khartoum and the Christian or animist black population in the south, the government, the Khartoum government, sought to exploit tensions between different tribes and ethnic groups in South Sudan. And the concepts of tribe and ethnicity in South Sudan, they often overlap. So now, the militia system in Sudan was not as organized as in Iraq, but they still became a very important part of the Sudanese counterinsurgency operations. And again, in Sudan, since the 1960s, pro-government militias have always been part of the government operations. This was the case in South Sudan in the 1970s, in the 1980s. This was also the case in Darfur. So, we're talking about an institution that really became entrenched in Sudanese counterinsurgency culture. Now, we also have to remember that the South Sudanese society is divided into about 65 different ethno-linguistic groups. And historically, these groups experienced conflicts and competition over resources and especially cattle raids. So the Sudanese government, right, the Sudanese authorities had a lot to work with. And just as in Iraq, the Sudanese government started by arming tribes on an ad hoc basis in order to fight the insurgents. But in the mid-1960s, it became much more organized. And the Sudanese Interior Ministry, through its secret police in South Sudan, organized some of these collaborators into what they call the National Guard, or Al-Haras al-Watani. And just like the Kurdish Afwaj, each of these guards drew on the same ethnic tribal group. The commanders of the units came from the same group as the fighters. And each group received weapons, special identification cards, and on some occasions they also got uniform. Again, it wasn't as organized as in Iraq. And much as in the case of Iraq, the militias in South Sudan didn't really deliver on the military side. And they exhibited the same problems as the Kurdish counterparts, right? They switched sides easily. They sold their weapons to the insurgents. They abused the local population, and they fought very poorly. They were not as dedicated as the rebels in most of the cases, right? They were often described as demoralized, incompetent, underarmed, undertrained. So, at least in one documented occasion, you actually had military officers refusing to allow National Guards to even man checkpoints around the battlefield. In fact, at one stage, the Sudanese Prime Minister, Sadiq al-Mahdi, declared in 1966 his intention to abolish this militia system. And because and these are his words, he argued that many of them are disorganized and the recruitment has taken a political nature. But it didn't dissolve the system eventually. And again, I argue that it was for the same reason that the Ba'ath government kept its militias, right? Because these militias ended up serving the purpose of manipulating and dividing the southern population, the southern rebel constituency, right? The fact that the government could enlist some tribes and have them on their side helped them to distinguish between loyal Southerners and hostile Southerners, right? There were these peaceful and loyal groups that received benefits from the government, and there were the extremist and disloyal groups that suffered persecution. And there was a lot of government tried to use the heads of these militias, the head of the tribes that collaborated with the government, as a way to show the benefits of collaborating with the government, right? They gave them they gave them their own special guards that protected their homes. They gave them cars. They gave them money. So beyond their military use, these sultans actually served the government propaganda. Okay, so I also promised to try and show the, do you have a few more minutes just to link? Yeah. Excellent, thank you. So I just want to demonstrate the relevance of my research to more contemporary affairs. And again, because I think I don't have a lot of time, I'll focus mostly on Iraq post-2003. And since the overthrow of the Ba'ath regime in 2003, the Iraqi governments have engaged in an ongoing counterinsurgency campaign, right? Mainly against Sunni insurgents in what is known as the Sunni Triangle. Now, and the recruitment of pro-government militias from among the Sunni Arabs has actually been a key aspect of this campaign. Right? So already in 2004, during the insurgency in Fallujah, the Marine Forces and the Iraqi Security Council tried to form, or they formed what they named as the Fallujah Brigade. Right? So they tried to recruit about 1,000 fighters from among the Sunni, from among the population of Fallujah. Now, the Fallujah Brigade didn't really work particularly well, so it was dissolved after 2 months. But this didn't really stop the Iraqi government and the coalition forces from trying to engage with this kind of strategy again. So when sectarian violence erupted in Iraq, again in 2006, the coalition forces and the Iraqi intelligence turned to other local defectors, let's say, to defeat the Sunni insurgency, first in the Anbar province, but then in other Sunni and also southern Shia provinces, right? So this was the background to the rise and ascent of what we know now as the Sons of Iraq, right? The forces that were made of fighters from Sunni tribes who had previously fought against Al-Qaeda, but now joined the coalition forces and the government in fighting the jihadists. Now, again, in this case too, the rift between the Sunni tribes and the jihadists began before the coalition came up with the idea of the Sons of Iraq. But the government and the coalition were quick to use these rifts, right? To use these divides in order to try and encourage these Sunnis to flip sides and join them. The new recruits to the system were not necessarily superior fighters, but the fact that the government managed to have, and again at their peak, the number of these recruits reached about 100,000 people. The fact that the government was capable of encouraging this number of people to join their side, it actually had a very important political and symbolic value for the authorities. Now, interestingly enough, a number of studies of these counterinsurgency operations suggested that this kind of strategy is unprecedented, right? So, for example, there's a report that was produced by Rand Corporation about the Fallujah Brigade, right, in 2005, and they described the recruitment of these insurgents as an exceptional strategy. But obviously, this is not the case, and I think there's a wonderful book by David Kilcullen, who was an advisor to the Iraqi army in the field, and he pointed out, he also discussed the awakening and the use of this. And if I'm not mistaken, he also, it doesn't make the link between this strategy and the history of the use of militias in Iraq. Now, but the point is that, and this is the point that I'm trying to make, is that this idea, this strategy has been entrenched in the Iraqi mindset, at least since the 1960s. And just an interesting fact is that the Iraqi intelligence, the post-2003 Iraqi intelligence, was also involved in the formation of both the Fallujah Brigade and the Sons of Iraq, right? So members of the, some of the members of the 2003, of the post-2003 intelligence service actually had a history of service in the Ba'ath military or the Ba'ath security services. And so, for example, the director of intelligence until 2009, the person who came up with the idea of the Fallujah Brigade, was Mohammed al-Shahwani, who was also a senior officer in Saddam Hussein's Republican Guards. So the point is that you actually had people who had some experience with these militias before, actually carrying out their knowledge and ideas about the system in the post-2003 period. Now, okay, so just to conclude, the problem with the use of pro-government militias is that it comes with a price, right? And the continued centrality and importance of militias in conflict is bound to turn them eventually into political actors, right? You can't recruit these militias based on their political and social value and accept that they would fade away once the situation is, once the violence comes to a stop. And in many cases, these militias, especially when they have an opportunity, they will end up becoming political actors, right? Social actors. The Sons of Iraq, after Al-Qaeda was pushed away from the Anbar and from Salahuddin, they became political actors, right? They used their function as a militia, as a leverage to gain some political power. Same goes, for example, to the Janjaweed militias in Sudan. As you know, Omar al-Bashir, the Sudanese president, was overthrown last year. And among the new power brokers in Khartoum are these Janjaweed militias. So, so the point I'm trying to make here is, and again, I'm concluding my presentation now, is that if militias are becoming growingly prominent in certain countries, and again, Iraq and Sudan are just two examples for that. And if you actually accept my argument that these militias are, from the onset, from the recruitment, social and political actors whose functions go beyond just fighting, then you have to be prepared for the fact that at some stage, they will end up claiming their place in politics and society. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much.
Great, Jana, I don't know if you want to continue to stand up there. You might, but
I'm happy to
sit over here.
Yeah,
It might be easier.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. I thought what I'd do is abuse my prerogative as masters of ceremonies to ask two questions, and then we can open it up. One of the questions is methodological, the other is theoretical. So, methodologically, how do you distinguish when you're doing the archival work or your case studies between the various government motivations? So if we imagine among the motivations are, a government may want to expand its ability to control territory at low cost, so it doesn't have enough manpower with traditional armed forces, so it recruits local militia. A second is the intelligence value, like they want to, as you mentioned, they want to recruit locals because they know more about the insurgency. This would be kind of a Kalivas argument about why it would be more effective. And then the third is the kind of divide and rule. Strikes me a lot of the documents would speak to the same thing, because if you have a document that says we need to recruit from this village and from this tribe and from this sect, it's not incompatible with any of these three explanations. So I wonder how you discern in your research between them. So that's question one. And then the theoretical question, which builds, I think, off the last part of your presentation on the Sons of Iraq, the Sahwa, the awakening in Iraq, is that most of your theoretical model, such that it is largely about the top-down incentives that states have to stand up these militias. But there is a bottom-up demand from localities to stand up these militias. And what was interesting in the Sahwa example was that there were attempts in 2004 and 2005 to create tribal forces to join with the coalition against Al-Qaeda, and they failed. And it wasn't until 2006 when a combination of Al-Qaeda and Iraq's threat going up and the threat from the Americans going down that the calculation shifted. And that suggests that at least a necessary factor is the security imperatives of the locals, because the strategy was the same from the government, the security imperatives. So how do you factor in these kind of bottom-up or the motivations of the militia themselves?
Okay, so I mean, as for the first question, I think that there doesn't necessarily have to be a distinction between the different considerations. Governments may start with a certain consideration, and this is something that I try to show. It's not the Ba'ath government continue the system that started in previous years, assuming that these militias could have some functions in the battlefield. But what I tried to show is that there was a certain process of learning. So at some stage, they started realizing the value, the added value of these militias. So it's not necessarily that they were formed as social and political forces, but they evolved as such. And again, there's not necessarily contradiction between trying to benefit from the different services that these militias can provide to the government, right? So the government can try and use them as to police the neighborhoods. So again, very low profile security purposes, but also to benefit from the but also to benefit from the way that they affect the rebel society, the rebel constituency. So I don't see this. I don't see the different uses as a contradiction, but as different aspects that played in different times. And now, as for the second question, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's both sides are part. You know, both parties are both sides are parties to this decision to employ militias, right? I mean, for example, in the case of the tribal militias during the Ba'athist, they needed the Ba'athist support. They needed the weapons to fight against the Barzanis, for example, to settle down more ancient scores between them. They definitely had some advantages in getting, and also, again, they benefited financially. They got just like the Sahwa leaders, they got contracts. They got nice cars. They got under the Ba'athist regime, the greatest benefit was to get a monthly salary. They also got employment opportunities for the members of their tribes or communities. So they definitely had an interest in joining these militias, in joining the government. And this is something that the government was very conscious of, and it's something that the government wanted to take advantage of. And you can actually see the governments in both Sudan and Iraq, they were very knowledgeable about the different tribal divisions, about the conflicts between the different groups, right? There was, they much like colonial governments before that, they invested a lot in this pseudo-anthropology of understanding domestic conflicts, and that was for the purpose of taking advantage of them. I hope I managed to answer your questions properly.
Okay, great. So we'll open it up, and what I'd ask is that you tell Jana who you are, and if there's like a one sentence to give him some context, that would be great. We'll go to Melissa first.
So this is super fascinating, and you've clearly done so much work and really dug into all of these documents. And so I guess my question.
Tell Jana who you are.
Yeah, my apologies.
Yeah.
Melissa Carlson, I'm a pre-doctoral fellow at CSAC. My dissertation, which I am finishing up currently, explains variation of the provision of support to foreign militias. So focusing on U.S. government variation, U.S. government provision of support to Syrian militant groups and then Iraqi militant groups. So,
okay,
like I said, fascinating presentation. So my question is, and this kind of gets to Colin's, to one of Colin's questions about methods, is I'm curious. You had mentioned that the Kurdish tribes that were integrated into the NDB, that they were already hostile towards the Peshmerga prior to their integration into these paramilitary forces. And so I'm wondering if because these militias were, or because these tribes were already hostile, you know, if, let's say, like in a counterfactual world, the Iraqi government didn't integrate them into paramilitary forces, would we have expected those tribes to support the Peshmerga, or would we have expected them to fight against the Peshmerga or do nothing? And the reason why I ask that question is because if, you know, for example, they were going to support the Peshmerga, that would, I think strengthen your argument. But if they weren't going to do anything anyway, I'm not exactly sure what the added social value or political value is of having those tribes.
It's a really good point. I mean, I think it's important to stress that these governments were not, sorry, that these tribes were not necessarily very hostile to the Kurdish nationalist aspiration. They were hostile to the Barzani tribe or to some of the tribes that supported the nationalist movement, exactly. But they didn't, and I think I have to be even more cautious. It's not as if, when a tribe when members of a certain tribe supported the Ba'ath government, it's not as if the whole tribe, there were some segments of the tribe that actually stayed neutral or even joined the rebels. So, the tribes are very complex creatures in this respect. Now, without government support, they would have found it much more difficult to fight against Barzani and the Peshmerga. Because the government provided them with means that they didn't. I mean, the government was the main. The government was the main provider of weapons and means that they couldn't get. Now, saying that it's the thing about counterfactual is it's very difficult to engage with it. I mean, would they not have fought against the Peshmerga if they didn't get government support? It's hard to say. I mean, but we know that they did have. I mean, they did have conflicts with the Barzanis before they got weapons from the government. The Iraqi monarchy was not particularly keen to arm tribes. They were in most of the cases they were almost obsessed with strengthening the Iraqi army because it was a symbol of Iraqi nationalism and power. So we can say that these tribes fought against these tribes fought against each other even before. But government intervention did intensify this violence, right? Same goes for Sudan. The idea, for example, of cattle rustling, right, and cattle raids, it existed for centuries, if not more. But once the government started providing them with AK-47, the whole dynamics of fighting between these groups changed, right? And then you have then you have these institutions of vendetta and revenge becoming even more becoming even more acute. So these social divides became deeper. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it could have been that these divides would have gone on without government support. But government intervention and recruitment of these militias deepened the rifts between these groups.
Go ahead.
Sorry, this is just such a fascinating discussion. So you just said that parts of some tribes went to the NPD and parts went with the opposition. Some neutral. So I'm wondering, because one of the things that I thought of, this is more of a comment and not really a question, but one of the things that I thought of was one of the reasons why defector militias may be more effective than just normal pro-government militias is because when you have a cousin fighting cousins, or at least the rebel cousin may be more hesitant to use violence or may want to use different types of violence than they originally would have. And so I'm wondering if you saw kind of any of that hesitance within the documentation. But that seems to me, and I don't know if you've explored it or not, but to be a direct social like added on value of defector militias. But that's just, sorry. That was
it's an excellent point. It's an excellent point. The only problem with, I think that this is, it's actually a point that it makes a lot of sense. I think I didn't dedicate a lot of attention to that just because the archives themselves, they're more focused on what the military officers have to say about the situation rather than what the rebels have to say. But yeah, this point makes a lot of sense, right? Once you create these rifts within the tribes, again, I think it affects the cleavages and the rifts within the society in ways that that make them even more complicated to solve afterwards.
That's funny.
Fascinating project. Really enjoyed the talk. My name is Asfanya Mir. I'm a postdoc here, and I work on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. I wrote a dissertation on counterinsurgency, counterterrorism effectiveness, and ended up looking at some of the functions that militias have performed. And my argument ended up being fairly state-centric in terms of at least the cases that I looked at. Militias didn't have a major role in my story, but I was struck by the repetition of the argument that the militias, or co-ethnic militias especially, have this intelligence collection function. And in a lot of the cases that I was evaluating, yes, there were militias, but they were not really performing that function. So what were they doing? Was a puzzle that I left with, but didn't really resolve. And I think you've helped me resolve some of that. And I'm very sympathetic to the argument that they are social and political features. They provide important utility in terms of political capital in favor of the regime, binding them potentially networks of patronage, maybe creation of political winners, rival political players to rebels, prestige, etc. And I think we've heard a lot of these points being made in the context of pro-state political parties during counterinsurgency operations, but not really in the context of militias. So this is useful. Also reminded me of one particular case a lot, Kenya. The loyalist class that emerged in the counterinsurgency operation there in the 1950s. How the Kikuyu Home Guard, among others, were recruited and ended up, tying with your last point on the lasting impact, the fact that they ended up shaping the politics of independent Kenya. Again, it reminded me of Daniel Branch's book. So that was my commentary action. But I wonder if you're building a theoretical model here, a theory. Do you think you might be able to go as far as to say something about who ought to be targeted in terms of recruitment, or empirically at least? What are you seeing? Like, what are we? Do these groups have to be close to the rebel base, rival to the rebel base? Any sort of theoretical prediction on?
So I mean, that's first of all, thank you very much for the kind words, and I'm glad I managed to kind of address one puzzle in a way, at least offer some alternative perspective on militias. I suppose that's my main purpose with this, at least with this particular piece. I haven't really. I think I'm using these militias more. I'm using this research more as a way to try and propose certain variables that I think haven't really been looked at before. So I haven't theorized as of yet. I haven't developed this into. It's more a proposal for future potential research on a more large and more formal theorization of this concept. But I think, but there are definitely certain conditions that really have to exist in order for this system to develop. Of course, you have to have societies where loyalty, where affiliation, where sympathy with the government derives from ethnic or sectarian identity, right? So for both the Ba'ath government and the Sudanese governments were completely obsessed with questions of identity, right? For the Ba'ath government, yes, it was supposedly it wasn't a sectarian tribal government, but at the end of the day, it identified certain groups that was supposed to be naturally more loyal to the government. Same goes for the Sudanese government, right? The Sudanese governments, again, in theory at least, they were the governments of everyone in Sudan. But at the end of the day, for them, those most loyal to the government naturally were Muslim and Arabs. So I think the likelihood of these militias is, these militias are probably more likely to appear in societies and countries where where identities are being used by the authorities, by the governments, as a way to assess loyalty, to assess. The Iraqi government tried to separate these rebels it tried to intensify tribal, sectarian, and other parochial affiliations because it believed that this is how people perceive themselves. So that would be the most important precondition for the appearance of such actors, I think, I would say.
My question is about the defectors.
Yeah.
You know, I got the chance to know some of the Peshmergas in the 80s that was in higher rank, kind of worked with the Barzani themselves, and they become refugees in Europe. And when I was talking with them, I realized that how depressed they were and why they left Peshmerga, because why they left Iraq, because they felt always the betrayal and there would not be any chance for them. I laughed later on with them. I said, if you stayed, then you would be prime minister or vice president later on. But, you know, still I cannot imagine that they would defect. They become refugees even in Australia and Europe and everywhere, but they didn't defect. My question is that, have you done any research that what is the background, how those who defected, how they think, thought about this stuff, what was the reasoning to defect and work with the bad party? Because it's a very big step to change from Peshmerga to defector.
So that's an interesting point, by the way. Again, I might be mistaken, but I think that in one case, even one of Mustafa Barzani's sons actually ended up defecting to the side of the Ba'ath regime at one stage. But I might be mistaken. It might be. I remember reading that one of his sons worked with the government for some time. But again, but there are quite a few reasons why even individuals and groups that were very loyal to their cause at the beginning ended up switching sides. And again, there's rivalries within the rebel groups, right? Competition over power, individuals being pushed aside by the leaders of the by the leaders of their movement. If I can switch from Iraq to the case of Sudan, because it's really fascinating. In Sudan, in Sudan in the 1980s and 1990s, some of the fiercest pro-government militias were led by individuals that before that were the key founders of the National Liberation Movement. So Riek Machar, who's now the leader of who's also involved in the current civil war in South Sudan. Right? These people were the heart of the rebel movement, and they switched to the government side. And they actually had to do with rivalries within the movement, pressures from the bottom, right? Pressures from their supporters to get them more resources. The problem is it's very hard to predict who would cross the lines and who might stay. So yeah, of course, it's very hard. For example, if we go back to the case of Iraq, it's hard to imagine Mustafa Barzani or Jalan Talabani becoming Josh. But there were many reasons that the leaders of these groups ended up defecting. It could have been greed. It could have been fear of retaliation by the Barzanis or the KDP. Again, social pressures to get more resources and benefits from the government. Okay. So I think to summarize it, it's very difficult to predict who would defect. But there are many reasons for why individuals and groups would defect. And definitely when it comes to mass ethnic defection, when large parts of your tribe and family or clan switch to the side of the government, it's very hard to actually to choose the other side. Because if you do that, you end up disconnecting yourself from your family. If your brothers and cousins and your extended family decides to switch to the government side, as an individual, there's very little you can do.
Colin, you have
Sure, yeah, thanks a lot. I'm Colin Garvey. I'm a postdoc here and at the Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute. So I have a broad question. If you were living in a country experiencing rapid social fragmentation, rising ethno-nationalism, and an authoritarian leader that is quickly turning to non-traditional fora to bolster power and entrench his rule, going into that, and this country has many militias throughout the rural parts. What would you be on the lookout for in terms of actors hastening social fragmentation by either encouraging, we talk about it as a maybe astroturf militia, where it appears to be a bottom-up thing, but in fact, as you point out, government support, once they have AK-47s, it's a different game. Are there signs to look out for? Do you think this is possible in advanced democracies today?
It's a good question. You know, when you talked about divided society, then I'm coming from Britain after Brexit, minus the militias for now, right? But you can see some preliminary signs. I mean, if I take the case of Sudan, for example, in the 1950s, the government actually objected, right? They didn't allow certain tribes to traffic weapons from Uganda to use in their local feuds, right? So, for example, there's one of the tribes that in Sudan, one of the ethnic groups that was always part of the government counterinsurgency was the Mule. For some reason, these particular groups often ended up joining the government ranks. In the 1950s, you actually have in the archives, right, orders to prevent this particular group from gathering weapons through Uganda, or I think it was through Uganda. And then in the 1960s, is it me?
It's just the Russians listening.
Oh, they always do.
Or all the above.
So the government sensed, right? So the government sensed the potential for violence. But in the 1950s, it was in the government's interest to try and prevent this violence, right? And then in the 1960s, the same group that was deprived of their weapons actually ends up getting weapons from the government, right? So it's very hard for me to identify very clear signs of what happened there. But obviously, the government knew. The government had a very clear sense of what was going on, right? And this goes to the fact that these governments were pretty much obsessed with understanding internal dynamics in these societies, right? You have a lot of reports, you have a lot of studies in both of the archives about, studies about the different connections and relations between groups in these societies, right? These were not academics, right? These were military officers, and I think their obsession with internal conflicts in these societies stemmed from the understanding that there's some potential for using it.
Thank
you. Thank you very much.
Other questions? Melissa.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about, so you had mentioned in the presentation that after these defector militias aligned with the Ba'athist, sorry, I'm stuck in Iraq.
Yeah,
if you
absolutely.
have examples from the Sudan case too, please, I'd love to hear them. But I'm wondering, you had said that they, might flip back to the opposition or might, sell the weapons, et cetera, to the highest bidder. I'm wondering if you could talk about the frequency with which that happened. Because just how often did, different brigades within the National Defense Battalions defect back to the Kurdish nationalists, or just stop fighting after they had gotten government support?
I don't have a clear statistics on that, I have to admit, but it appears enough, right? It appears enough in the documents, right? There are quite a few reports about heads of militias being punished, being executed because they fled, right? There's a constant attempt to try and trace new mustachas, right? To identify new potential recruits, and I think that this is a very clear indication to the fact that this whole system was very unstable. I mean, I think it would be the right thing to do to try and quantify it, but it is difficult. It is difficult. Because we are talking about a very large quantity of I mean, I think, and the fact that the government constantly try to follow these mustachas and heads of tribes is another good indication for the fact that they didn't trust them. They didn't trust them. They needed them. They identified the benefit of using them, but they knew that they could not be trusted. But but that's, I think that kind of strengthens my point. If you can't trust them militarily, right, the fact that they switched sides constantly doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the rebels can support them. Can trust them. So the divides remain, right? So yeah, so the Peshmerga, because they needed people, because they needed the weapons, they embraced those who switched back, but they didn't trust them. So if the rebels can't trust each other, you've achieved, yeah, and again, there was in the Intifada, in the 1991 Intifada, the first one, so if you know a bit about the Intifada, the Shia Intifada, the so-called Shia Intifada, it started in Basra, but it soon spread to the north. And the first one to join the Intifada, the first one to start the Intifada in the north, in the Kurdish parts, were actually former Jash, because they were upset about the government they were upset about the government targeting their own villages in the Anfal. By the way, this is another thing that happened in the Anfal campaign. The government didn't spare the Jash villages. They attacked them. They burned them down too. So. So the system was not built on trust. It was built about destabilizing society.
So I have one last question, which is, so by the logic of your argument, I wonder if you can think about cases in which states do this prophylactically, all right? So we know from the experience of states and from colonial regimes that divide and conquer strategies are frequently used. Now, usually it's about empowering a minority or some ethnic group against other groups, but you're also trying to peel off co-ethnics and make them collaborators in surveillance and in rule. So I wonder whether there in your research or you can think of examples where this is done prophylactically. So, for example, in the stand-up of the Hashd-e-Shaabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, obviously the main cause of this was initially, as it relates to the Iranian-backed groups, to fight the Americans, and then from a more populist standpoint to fight the Islamic State. But it also serves as a useful tool now for the very political actors that have been empowered by these militia to police their own, that is, to police an intra-Shia political competition and create political advantages vis-a-vis rivals. But I kind of made all that up. I wonder if you had a view of either that case or other cases based on your experience.
I haven't really delved into this question, but I mean, even when it comes to the Hashd-e-Shaabi is a really interesting example because they're not exactly defectors, right? I mean, they do represent they don't threaten the idea of Shia dominance in Iraq or any of
Although the Iranian slice of them, the reason I ask this is that the Iranian slice of them have been alleged to be involved in the crackdown against cross-sectarian protests against corruption in the government that include a lot of secular Shia or nationalist Shia young people on the streets, right? So it is they serve a policing function for the system against an uprising. Anyway, just it may be something to
it's something
noodle through. As
yes, no, it is something to think about, and you're right. I mean, no, it's a really good point to think about. It's something that I would take into account.
Yeah, I would encourage, maybe as the project grows, I think you're right about that maybe in this narrow literature there isn't a lot about these particular motivations, but I think there's a broader literature about civil wars, about state control, et cetera, that is very, and colonial rule, that is very conscious of these divide and conquer strategies and maybe incorporating.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a good point. I'm not, the idea that governments use divide, there's nothing new in my argument that governments use divide and rule. It's just that I try to add a different dimension to it and show that, in addition to the tools that we're familiar with, there are also other tools that we end up overlooking. And again, and the Hajj Shabi could also be a really good example for that.
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned David Kilcullen, and he, has written a lot, and so the body of his writing that I've read. I mean, in it, he pretty explicitly makes the case for militias, co-ethnic militias, and having this intelligence collection function. So I wonder if in the paper version of this, you were offering policy recommendations on doctrinal revision in both, in the standard counterinsurgency doctrine of military, like the U.S. military, want to suggest something to the U.S., as well as in the doctrinal writings of SOFs, special operations forces, which are certainly interested in raising, irregulars and these kinds of militias fall in that category.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely hope to. When I developed this project and I started developing it into a broader project, I definitely hope to get up to come up with certain. And I think one of the points that I made toward the end is you have to take into account that at the end of the day, these militias, they don't stop when you decide that they need to stop. I mean, I think David Kilcullen's book, it is really, it's a great book. I mean, it was in the field, it was there, so everything taking place. But I think that the book came out in 2011, if I'm not mistaken. I think he didn't really get a chance to see, the transmutation of these militias once again after 2013, 2014, and now, right? So I based at least on the research that I've done so far, I think that there's a tendency to overlook or to ignore the very negative implications that these militias have on society and politics in general, even for an authoritarian regime. At the end of the day, it's very difficult to control these actors beyond the confines of the ongoing conflict. And Sudan is an excellent example for that, right? Omar al-Bashir nurtured the Janjaweed. They ended up those that are actually replacing him now. So, again, that's the most important policy recommendation I can make now. Be very, very careful about how you nurture and develop these pro-government militias, whether you're coming from the outside or the inside.
Well, thankfully, we live in a democracy where we would never incite government militias to divide against ourselves.
Of course.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
All right. Anyway, thank you very much. It's been a busy day here at CSAC. I think there's been like 45 events. So thank you for joining us. And Jana, thank you for presenting early parts of your work. I think that we will all be on the lookout for how this evolves. And thanks again for coming to Stanford, and happy hunting in the Ba'athist archives.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.